insight into your pasture management, which is brought to you by Leading Sheep. The presenter today is Col Paton from EcoRich Grazing, based in Roma. And as you can see, he's covering a number of topics on today's webinar. So without anything further from me, I'll hand over to Col to take you through today's presentation.
Thank you, Alex. I'm just going to bring up the slide presentation. Hello, everyone. Try that again. There we go. Now, the presentation I'm going to give today is based mainly on the mulga lands, but I'm going to draw on examples from around central Queensland and the southern part of the state to help with some of the other issues, and also that Alex tells me the webinar is going much more wide than just the mulga lands, even though he's in Charleville. So you hopefully, there are some general aspects to this, but hopefully you'll see some examples that apply to your situation. What I want to do is, towards the end, get you to ask me questions. But if you have questions along the way that you think are pertinent, then make sure you ask them as well. Okay. I'll make a start. I've just changed the slide, and it shows the issues that I'll be looking at and addressing today. So we're going to have a look at fire as a part of the grazing land ecosystem, and some of those things that I've heard people say about fire, that it destroys organic matter, that all the nutrients go up in smoke, so you're left with none, and that it adds to global warming. We'll have a look at those a little later and have a look at some of the facts. We want to look at the roles fire can play in managing grazing lands, how we can use fire without damaging our country, and planting fire breaks. And planting is a very important part of using fire. Now, this was a common sight at the end of the last growing season, at the end of summer. It's a little bit different now. We've had a lot of frost in central and southern Queensland, so it's a lot more hayed off looking. And we've got very high fuel loads in a lot of parts of the state going into the next fire season. So those fuel loads can pose a threat to some or an opportunity to others. It's our chance to make them an opportunity and take the best advantage of the situation that we have. Unlike this fella here, it's a bit of a threat to him. I suggest he might have the wrong tool for the job. And fire is a tool, and it needs to be used wisely, and that's something that we need to keep in mind all the time. Now, in my many years of travelling around, working, doing research and extension in the grazing lands of Queensland, I've heard a lot of comments about fire. Here are just a couple of them. I'll go through them. Fire is no good for the country. I've seen a wildfire go through paddocks and they didn't recover for 5 or 6 years, and that was in the western part of Queensland. Fire did a good job on my wattles, and I've heard that in many places, not so in others. Fire scalds the ground and nothing grows. And another lag in the Burnett, in the black speargrass zone, was sitting in his ute, and he enjoyed burning in spring. He threw a match out the window into the speargrass, and the fire started crackling away, and he said, listen to the sound of that, like the sound of money being made in the mint. And another fellow from a similar region said that you only have to burn 1 square metre to pay for the cost of the match. I'll go to the next slide now, and what I'm going to do is ask you for your experiences with fire. If you could raise your hand before, so that you can ask a question, that'd be great. Just to prompt someone. I know if Jim and Trish from Gamaran are online, they had a wildfire on their place out near Cunnamulla last year, and it'd be interesting to hear from them to see how the country came back after that fire over the last summer. Has anyone got going to share their experiences?
Cole, I'll start off. It's Alex Sturton here. We had a fire at home last year. We're based in between Charles and Quilpie and had a fire start from a lightning strike and burnt through some pulled mulga country and yeah, a lot of turkey bush and flannel bush in there and burnt a fair area, and it's actually come away really well this year. Got rid of a lot of the turkey bush and flannel bush, or reduced it anyway, and a lot of the timber obviously on the ground, and a lot of new growth you can see between, I guess, where it wasn't burnt, and a lot of old rank feed there. And this year it's been a lot of fresh feed come away, so we were pretty impressed with what it did in the pulled mulga country for us.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, that's good. I've heard that quite a bit, having spent some time in the desert uplands recently after the wildfires last year. That is a common reaction. Okay, well, if there's no one else wants to pipe up at the moment, make sure you ask me questions about that later on, or make a comment about fire on your place later on. We might move on then, and we'll move to the next slide. In Australia, let's take a historical look at fires in Australia. And basically, there have been 3 periods of fire in Australia. The first was prior to any human settlement, and at that time, there would have been, those fires would have been infrequent. There would have been a big build-up of fuel, so that when they did occur due to lightning strike or perhaps from volcanic ash, they would have been hot fires and covered probably large expanses of country. Aborigines settled in Australia, or came to Australia about 46,000 years ago, and they started their fire stick farming, where fires became a little more regular, and in a lot of circumstances they would have been cooler, but in years like this year and previous years, you'd question that. Perhaps they also had very hot fires in these periods of high rainfall. And we arrived, European settlement occurred a couple of hundred years ago, and fire regimes changed. In many circumstances, fire was suppressed, so there were less fires in many cases, and in others, there may have been overuse. The thing about this is that we've always had fire as part of our landscape, and it always will be a part of our landscape, and it's formed part of our ecosystem. So that, particularly in our eucalypt woodlands and our open grasslands of Mitchell grass and bluegrass, those areas have evolved with fire as part of their ecology, and they're what we call fire climax communities. So the species that exist there and the biodiversity that is there have largely evolved with fire as part of their ecology. So let's have a look at some of those statements that have been made that I brought up a moment ago in the introduction. One of those is fire destroys all the organic matter. Another one is that all the nutrients go up in smoke, and by burning we're adding to global warming. Well, that's obvious, but let's have a closer look at some of the facts behind those statements. So fires and soil organic matter. There's a fellow by the name of Shane Campbell, some years ago, did his PhD in the speargrass country around Gayndah, and he looked at the effects of fires on both black speargrass and wiregrass, and he measured the temperatures in grass fires. He found that above ground they range from 250 degrees Celsius to 450 degrees Celsius. So that's pretty hot. Obviously it consumes all the fine fuels like the grass. That would be enough to scorch leaves on trees and perhaps blacken the trunk and perhaps kill some of the smaller woody weeds. But 1 centimetre below ground level, he had thermocouples in the ground, in the soil. The temperatures only range from 30 degrees to 60 degrees. So the soil insulates everything, the organic matter within the soil, from the heat very well. And we find that, just as a way of comparing, soil surface temperatures in summer regularly reach more than 60 degrees in Queensland and northern parts of Australia. So those soil temperatures 1 centimetre below ground during a fire are less than or equal to the temperatures that we would see in a normal summer in northern Australia. So they're unlikely to be consuming the organic matter that's in the soil. We also know that many of our grass seeds, and in particular black speargrass in this case, is unaffected by short bursts of high temperature. So Shane found that it took greater than 120 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes or more to actually kill that seed. So they have some tolerance to heat. Now the other thing is that if you can burn in springtime after rain, it will actually help to retain ground cover. And the photo you can see on the slide in front of you is one that I took after a landholder had burnt this paddock following 45 mils of rain. So he burned a couple of days after rain, and a couple of days after the fire, I went out and took this photo. I walked across the whole paddock, and there was just about 100% ground cover there. There was litter on the ground, and the top of that litter had been scorched, but because it was wet and the ground was wet, it was only blackened on top, and that litter was retained on the ground. And you can see there that even a few days after the fire, it's actually responding, and there's some green shoot coming away. So burning after rain can help to retain ground cover, and you know that the pastures are going to respond quite well. Now, those figures I mentioned before, or those temperatures I mentioned before, in grass fires aren't always the case. So fires that have that are cool to moderate in temperature won't destroy organic matter, but that's not always the case. There are risks, and those risks are usually associated with hot fires. They can be hot fires that occur later in the year, around Christmas time when we have wildfires, but often those fires that are associated with fallen timber, and that fallen timber can destroy this soil organic matter, pasture seed in the ground, and we end up with a loss of ground cover and loss of nutrients to the atmosphere. So we'll have a look at that in a little more detail. Just by way of comparison, grass fires usually have fuel loads of that range from about 1,500 kilograms per hectare to 5,000 kilograms per hectare. Now we know with mulga, where that's been pulled multiple times, for example 3 times, there's going to be a lot higher fuel loads in those cases. An example of high fuel loads occurred, or that I can relate to, that I'll give to you, is where under eucalypt stands in the mountains of Barrier Range in New South Wales, just before some of the fires in the 70s and 80s, the litter on the ground amounted to 40 tonnes per hectare. So that's a huge quantity of material composed of leaves, bark, twigs, and obviously fallen branches. So mulga country that's been pulled up to 3 times could be getting up to those sorts of fuel loads. That's 4 kilograms per square metre, and that's a high fuel load. So when that burns, it burns for a much longer time in the one spot, and scalding can occur. It can destroy the soil organic matter, and it can also destroy the pasture seeds in the soil. However, in one of the experiments that Paul Jones conducted out near Charleville on pooled mulga, the mulga was woodland thickening that had come through after being pulled earlier, I think in the 50s. Then regrowth came through with the wet years in the 50s, and that was then pulled, I think, in the 90s, and in 98 it burnt. And he found that only 10% of that paddock was actually scalded. So what first appears to be large areas to be scalded may not be the case. Nonetheless, we need to be careful of that. And one of the potential solutions for overcoming having large scalded areas in paddocks where there's fallen timber from pulling is to try and avoid accumulating large quantities of wood by perhaps burning a little more frequently, and also to burn at cooler times of the year or after rain to reduce the amount of timber that's actually consumed by the fire. Because if we end up with scalding, then we end up with exposure and increased runoff due to erosion, increased soil temperatures, surface sealing, decreased infiltration because the water's not actually going in, and decreased biological activity. So also in those circumstances, when you get regrowth, you can get localised overgrazing. So those are the situations we want to avoid: losing ground cover as much as possible, avoiding those hot fires as best we can. But I'll give you an example here of where a paddock was burnt, and you'll see there's a little chart there showing two paddocks, and this was from experimental work that was done near on a property called Killenbeat near Rubyvale in central Queensland. And again, Paul Jones did this work. There were two paddocks. One was in poor condition and remained unburnt. The other paddock was actually in very good condition, so it had good pasture condition, good soil condition, and that paddock was burnt in October. About a month later, there was about 80 mils of rain in a storm on both those paddocks. Now, by that time, there was 50% ground cover in the paddock that was in poor condition and 40% ground cover in the paddock that was in good condition but was actually burnt. And if you have a look at the runoff that occurred on both those paddocks, 18% of the rain that fell ran off the paddock that was unburnt and in poor condition, whereas only 3% of the rain that fell on the good condition paddock that was actually burnt ran off. So 6 times the amount of rainfall ran off the paddock that was unburnt. So what that tells me is the most important thing is the condition of the country. Having your paddock in good condition, having your country in good condition, it means your soil's in good condition, which means it's much more capable of taking up rainfall when it does occur. So the infiltration rates on that paddock were much higher, and runoff of the rainfall was much more reduced due to it being in good condition. The fire had a much reduced impact because of that. So, having a look at another one of the issues, what about the nutrients? Where do they go when we have a fire? Well, as you can see here, a lot of the phosphorus, 50% of the phosphorus, can be transferred away in ash and in smoke. Most of the potassium goes the same way, 35% of the magnesium goes the same way. So 50% of the phosphorus is going back into the soil, some of the potassium, and the calcium and a lot of the others go back into the soil. But if you have a look at the carbon, the sulfur and the nitrogen, 90% of them go up in the atmosphere, so they're lost. Nearly all of that is lost to the atmosphere. So let's have a closer look and see what happens to those. What about the carbon? Let's look at the carbon first. Now here's a typical scenario prior to burning in spring. We had 3,500 kilograms per hectare of grass grown in the previous season. Now a third of that, here's a reasonable scenario with grazing. A third of that would be grazed, a third would be trampled, and that's incorporated back into the soil and becomes organic matter within the soil itself, and a third could be burnt in the following spring. So we're burning 1,200 kilograms per hectare of pasture, but in the next summer 3,500 kilograms per hectare of pasture grows again. So we're actually absorbing 3 times the amount of carbon from the atmosphere than what was burnt in the previous season. And most people only burn every 3 to 10 years. So the amount of carbon that's actually going up due to fires is much less than we might think it is. And that's coming back out of the atmosphere. In fact, talking to some of the soil scientists, they tell me that if that organic matter wasn't burnt and went back into the soil, a lot of that would be, when the microorganisms act on that, reduce carbon dioxide as well, and it goes up, eventually goes up into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide as well. Now, what about the nitrogen, one of the other nutrients? It's really important to us because it's what we require to get protein in plants, particularly in the grasses. They need to take nitrogen from the soil as nitrates. So let's have a look. So we mentioned a moment ago, if we're burning 1,200 kilograms per hectare of pasture, we know that nitrogen in our grass pastures gets diluted down to about 1/3% of the dry matter that remains, particularly in our grasses. So if we burn that, we're burning 4 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen that's going up in smoke. Now we also know that summer storms can contribute between 5 and 9 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen. So that's coming back into the soil. So that's a relatively small amount of nitrogen is actually going up in smoke due to it, the pasture that's getting burnt in the spring or summer being of such poor quality by the time we burn. But that's a fairly low figure I've got there of 1,200 kilograms per hectare relative to what we've got this year. And if you wanted to burn a paddock to perhaps control woody weeds, you might need 3,000 kilograms per hectare of pasture. Then in that case, there's 10 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare going up in smoke. So that's quite a bit more. We know that in most of our grazing lands in Queensland, there's between 10 and 30 kilograms of nitrogen cycling each year for grasses to use. But the flip side of that is that in most of our soils, there's between 3,000, in eucalypt woodlands, there's between 3,000 and 6,000 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare in the top 50 centimetres of soil. So the amount of nitrogen we're losing there relative to the amount of nitrogen that's in the top 50 centimetres of soil is very minimal. So let's move on now to some of the other threats. Of course, wildfire is a big threat, and we'll be looking at that over the next fire season, over the next spring and summer. In fact, today, sitting here, the wind is pretty wild at home, and if a fire got away, it'd be pretty hard to stop in a lot of places. So wildfires can destroy feed for stock, damage infrastructure, and destroy ground cover. And when ground cover is destroyed, then we can lose a lot of nutrients to erosion. Here's an example. I was asked to go to the Jericho, the desert uplands area, after the wildfires that occurred last year and give landholder support. And both DD and Desert Uplands supported me to do that. Here's a photo from a property called Bellevue, which is pretty close to where the fire started, and it shows you it was a really hot fire in that property, in that paddock, and scalding obviously would have occurred in that situation. So they were prone to losing nutrients in the next summer once we had storm rains. So to avoid these threats of wildfire, we need to try and build in some fire breaks. Usually you try and put in a couple of blade marks 20 to 30 metres apart and burn in between those in the cooler part of the year. But in those Jericho wildfires, those fires were spotting up to half a kilometre away from the fire front. So 20 to 30 metre breaks aren't going to cut it in those situations. And what people are doing up there now, or have done even before now, is to backburn breaks late in the evening in the cooler part of the year, and then let them go out of the night time, so that they've got fairly large breaks right around their paddock, and that's worthwhile doing. Even from now, while the temperatures are still cool in August, late in the evening, backburn and allow those fires to go out of a night time to create a reasonable sort of fire break right around the paddock. Moving on to the next slide, we'll just have a look at some of the unfavourable results that can occur with burning, depending on how you manage it before and afterwards. So this slide shows some of the unfavourable results. Just waiting for some people to come online. Burning small areas of large paddocks encourages stock to concentrate on those areas, and that can be detrimental to the pastures. You see in that photo on the right-hand side where stock had concentrated grazing in those areas, and we ended up with annuals and wiregrasses in those areas. So, and the other thing is that burning pasture during the growing season, once they started to grow and they've got their growing points, a fair bit of green leaf on them, we can actually damage those plants by burning them at that time of year. So we should be burning earlier in the year, from now perhaps through till November, October, November, and it's best to burn after rainfall if that's possible. And the last point I've got down there is burning fallen timber may cause bare and scalded areas, and we've already covered that. Now I'm going to move on to the next slide, which just shows ways to overcome those issues, burn whole paddocks, to avoid overgrazing of small areas, and destock. So spelling after burning, if you can spell until those pastures sit seed, then that's going to allow them to come back and be strong, so that you'll have good pastures into the future and land condition doesn't suffer. And burning pastures during the growing season is harmful, so burning late winter, spring or early summer. And again, with the fallen timber, avoid building large quantities of timber. Okay, on to the next slide. Let's have a look at some of the opportunities for using fire. Just going to check the time. And you can see I've got a photo for promoting green pick, for controlling species composition and evening up grazing. And we also have an opportunity with using fire to keep trees and grass in balance. And we'll touch on that in a bit more detail later on. But as I said before, most of our eucalypt woodlands have evolved with fire. And as I said, they're fire climax communities. Most of the species that exist there are used to fire. That's part of their ecology. So if we take fire out of the system, then we may reduce the biodiversity. Using fire can actually improve the biodiversity of some of the parts of our landscape. So what happens when we don't burn? Our pastures can accumulate old leaves of very poor quality. The nitrogen becomes tied up in the leaves of those plants. Those pastures become moribund, and that leaf matter actually falls back down on the plants and covers them. So it actually stops them from regrowing in many cases, and it stops new grass seedlings from coming through. And I have seen areas that were fenced out and excluded from all grazing for periods of 15 years go from good condition pasture back to really poor condition pasture dominated by wiregrass, by weeds and by tree regrowth. And those pastures also become unattractive for grazing. So if we burn those pastures, then we remove the old material. It stimulates growth of the pastures that are there, new growth of the pastures, and it actually improves the quality of the leaf growing because it reduces the amount of nitrogen tied up in the system. It can increase the proportion and availability of green leaf so that it increases the protein content of the leaves, and it can increase stock weight gains. And I have seen or been part of experiments where I've seen cattle increase their weight gains by more than 20 kilograms in 6 months where they've been grazing burnt pastures over unburnt pastures. It can also help to even up grazing in a paddock. So fire can also be very useful for managing species composition, and we'll have a look at that as well. In the mulga lands, trials have shown that sometimes if the fires are a little hot, moderate to hotter, annuals may dominate if the perennial grasses can dominate if the perennial grasses have been damaged. But in most cases, in the experiments that were conducted out there, perennials regrew quite rapidly if there was adequate soil moisture, and that's the big thing. How much rain occurs after the burning and how much grazing occurs after a fire, and also how much soil moisture was there prior to burning. So in most of those circumstances, pasture regeneration was not affected by fire. Even after periods of drought, they found that pasture regeneration wasn't affected. And there were high survival rates of most of the common grasses in the mulga lands. The one that did suffer was woolly butt. It's an Eragrostis species that was killed by fire, and it actually suffered 30% mortality in those experiments. So going on to the next slide, going to have a look at how fire affects some pasture species in the speargrass lands. And in general, fire reduces the competitive advantage of some of the undesirable species, those that are avoid grazing, particularly the wiregrasses. Not all wiregrasses are killed by fire, but some are. It encourages things like mulga Mitchell, mulga oats, and black speargrass. Now the next slide shows you a graph of the amount of speargrass in a pasture, and this was over a period of 1989 to 1993. Now this was an experiment that I was a part of, conducted in the black speargrass zone near Gayndah, and we had several paddocks where stock were grazed, and each of those paddocks was burnt in spring over that time period. So we had 3 fires, 1990, 1991 and 92, and you can see that there are 5 different treatments there. Now 3 of those paddocks were destocked straight after the fire in spring. We tried to burn after 1 or 2 inches of rain, and then cattle were taken out of 3 of those paddocks. They were put back into one paddock or one series of paddocks after 2 months. Some were put back into other paddocks after 4 months, and some were put back into other paddocks 6 months after the fire. In 2 lots of paddocks, cattle were kept in there. Firstly, at the same stocking rate as used in the other paddocks, but secondly, one series of paddocks were stocked at half the stocking rate of the other paddocks. And you can see that the amount of spear grass in those paddocks that were spelled for 4 months and 6 months and were stocked constantly, but only at half the stocking rate, the amount of spear grass in those paddocks went up much more to 4,000 kilos per hectare than the paddocks that were burnt and the stock remained in there, or they went back in 2 months after the fire. So burning and spelling had a big impact on the amount of spear grass in those paddocks, and the spelling was a key feature. So that's what happened to the spear grass. Let's have a look at what happened to the wiregrass. This was one of those tall stemmy wiregrasses, and it was actually reduced. That pasture before we started burning was actually in very poor condition and was dominated by wiregrass. So over the period of the 5 years or 4 years of the trial, the amount of wiregrass in those paddocks was reduced to from 1,400 kilos per hectare down to about 400 kilograms per hectare. So in that circumstance, fire encouraged black speargrass, which is one of our better grasses, and reduced the amount of wiregrass. We know that that doesn't happen in all cases with wiregrasses, but there's ones that are taller, more rank and wiry, fire usually does reduce the amount of wiregrass. Out in the mitchell grass country, the feathertop is reduced by burning. So that's pastures. Now we're going to have a look at the role of fire in managing that tree grass balance, and that's pretty important to a lot of people, particularly in years like we've just had. We've had some pretty good seasons. We've had lots of grass growth, but if you go out and have a look around in amongst that grass, you are likely to find there are lots of tree seedlings coming through, lots of woody weeds. I've just been out.
Alright, we just seem to have lost Col there for a second, so we'll just get him back online. He'll just be dialing back in again, so his phone's obviously just dropped out. So if we can just all hold on the line and we'll get Col back on. Alright, Col's just dialing back in now, so we'll just take this time to see if anyone's got any questions. So if you have, can you please raise your hand or type them into the question box. So if you've got any questions that you're thinking you want to ask Col, if you could just type them into the question box, or if you can raise your hand. So Col will be back online in just a second. Or if you've got any comments about what you might have done in the last year with fire or your experiences, if you want to share them with everyone else, then please raise your hand and feel free to, we can unmute you and you can share it with everyone. So.
Hello. You got me?
Yep,
Hello,
you're right,
Alex.
Col. Yep, you're back online, Col.
Yeah, righto. Hello. Sorry about that, folks. Just had a technical glitch. The phone dropped out. I was saying before that I've just been out west of Charleville, and in some of the channel country out there, there's a lot of coolabah seedlings getting away. I see a lot of box seedlings in many parts of the state, and also silverleaf and narrowleaf ironbark. So it's an opportunity now to get some control over some of those woody weeds. And this graph shows you the effect that our woody weeds have on pasture growth. And you can see here we've got the effect of green turkey bush canopy cover on the amount of grass on the left, graph on the left. And it only needs to get to 10% canopy cover to have a major reduction in the amount of pasture that grows. It's reduced to about less than half what it potentially could be, down to about a third. The graph on the right shows you the reduction in pasture growth you get due to tree and shrub cover as well. So let's have a look at burning to control tree regrowth. Now, the next one I'm going to bring up is a slide on fire and its effects on green turkey bush. And you can see here that the graph shows that there were 8,000 plants per hectare just prior to the paddock being burnt. And this is in a trial near Charleville. And the turkey bush was actually suppressed for 8 months before it started, 18 months I should say, and still it started coming back again. And by 32 months, 3 years later, there was still way less than half the number of plants per hectare of turkey bush. But it had reduced the canopy cover considerably so that the pastures could get away. And it would be important to have follow-up fires to get good control of that green turkey bush. Just as Alex was saying before, that the lightning strike on their property managed to clean up some of that turkey bush. It'll probably come back as it germinates after the fire. And it'll be important to get another fire in there and clean up those seedlings while they're young. So the recommendations are to use fuel loads of at least 1,000 kilograms per hectare of dry matter, allow the burnt area to regenerate, burn late winter to early spring, and follow up with another burn within a few years. Now, the next slide shows you a picture of a paddock from a property down near Bowen. This is Alan Browning's property, Marillion, near Bowen, and it's box country and box and pine and box and sandalwood. Alan developed that country over a period of about 18 years by pulling, and then while he was pulling, he seeded it with buffel grass, and then waiting for that buffel grass to build up a body of fuel and burning it after about 3 years. In that 3 years, he either took stock out completely to allow the fuel to build up, or he stocked it only very lightly. Now, he was very successful in controlling his box. You can see that on the photo that he's up there. There are some pine trees there. That's one of the first paddocks he developed, and the pine regrew. And the next photo that has come up on that slide is on the other side of the road. He burnt this paddock in 2 lots in recent years. On the top photo, on the left-hand side of the road, he didn't get as good a control as he did on the other side of the road with a hotter fire. And this is where the next slide shows some of his sandalwood country. Sandalwood is not often killed by fire. Usually there's only about 5 to 10% mortality of false sandalwood due to burning. But Alan built up high fuel loads and burnt in November, December and even into January, the hotter part of the year, and he was very successful at controlling his box and sandalwood. But they were hot fires, and the country would have needed some very good spelling or extended spelling after those fires so they could regenerate. But at least that is one success story with fire and controlling box and sandalwood. The next example is taken from a property called Glendonnell, which is northwest of Injune, and I see there's Jeff Nichols on here from Nindera, not too far from you. This country, Glendonnell, has been allowed to go back to pine, and it's become pine thickets in many large areas of that property. It was recently bought by the Warrion family, and they employed an ex-Rural Fires Board fellow by the name of Ray Klein to manage this place. Ray is very good at using fire, and you can see on the next photo, here's an example of one of the paddocks he burnt in 2010, and that looks like it's got pretty good control of the pine that was there. Now, that happened in, I think, November 2010. The next photo shows the response in the pasture by February, March 2011. And you can see there that their good species have come back, and most of those pines are killed. Pines, like mulga, are fairly easily killed by fire, but once they become really thick, hardly any grass grows, and it's very difficult to get a fire in there. But Ray was able to do that, obviously on a pretty hot and windy day in November. But the response has been terrific to that fire. Now, the next photo shows you, or the two photos, of the property speculation run by Bruce and Annette Curry north of Jericho. Now, as I mentioned before, I was sponsored by Dee and the Desert Uplands Group to go back to Jericho after the wildfires last year and help support landholders who had been burnt out during those wildfires. And the photo you can see in the top was taken a couple of weeks after the wildfires on speculation. The one underneath was taken in December after there was about 6 or 7 inches of rain in late November and early December. So that pasture has responded really well by mid-December. Despite that fire, they were quite hot fires that were moving really quickly, browning out that bloodwood tree right to the very top. It's regrown very easily because it's used to fire, and the pasture has responded quite well. And there, the next slide, you can see the bottom photo was taken in May this year. So that's probably 7 or 8 months after the fire, and you can see it's done really well. It's responded quite well, and that was the story that most people found. They were very lucky that they got rain within about 6 weeks after those wildfires went through, and the country responded really well. It would have been a different story had they not had rain for an extended period of time. Many of those pastures may have suffered. Okay, now I see some people are still catching up with some of these photos. I'll have to keep going. I'll try and talk you through them. Now the next photo is taken on a property called Park Gate, southwest of Jericho, and this is where the wildfires actually started from lightning in October last year, October 2011. Now, wildfires also went through this property in October 2010, and this whole paddock in the photo was burned in October 2010. In response to that initial fire, a rash of wattle seedlings came through, and that's what you can see in front. But in the wildfires of October 2011, the area on the left-hand side of the road was backburnt, was pretty close to the homestead to keep the fire from getting to the homestead. So you can see what's happened there with two fires. It's actually taken out nearly all the wattles on the left-hand side of the road. There are a few close to the road where the fire was cooler, but I can assure you that further out in that paddock, there would be at least 90–95% of those wattles killed with the second fire. It just shows you the importance of fires in controlling some of these things, these woody weeds. The first fire germinated a lot of seeds of wattles, and they came through with the good summer rains of 2010, 2011, but the second fire gave control of the wattles that were regrowing, and no seed germinated after that. The other thing to remember is that with wattles, and in particular, most of them don't set seed in the first 3 years of their life. So if you can get successive fires in, you've got a good chance of reducing the seed bank of wattles and controlling them with fire. And even mulga is reported to be stopped from setting seed after fire for up to 5, and in some cases in Central Australia, up to 10 years to 15 years after fires. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, most of our eucalypt woodlands have evolved with fire. So fire is important for maintaining biodiversity in a lot of our eucalypt woodlands. It's important to have patch areas that have been burnt last year, some areas that have been burnt 2 years ago, 3 years and 5 years and 10 years ago. Some of our things like marsupials like beddongs tend to live in the tall grass areas, and they forage in the short grass areas that are recently burnt. Other things like lizards, skinks and so forth, and geckos tend to live in the leaf litter, so they need areas that have been unburnt for a couple of years. So having a range of areas, if that can be achieved, that have been burnt a couple of years ago, some burnt last year, some burnt 5 or 10 years ago, is good for biodiversity. Patch burning can help. Not always easy to achieve, but if you can do that, then that's a good thing for biodiversity. So when it comes down to it, if we plan to use fire, good planning helps to make fire your servant and reduces the risk of it being your master. And I want to go through some of the planning process now before we finish up and have some questions. The first thing I would say is never burn for the sake of it. Always have a goal for burning in mind. That goal could be for managing pasture composition, as we mentioned earlier, for controlling woody weeds, or even for improving biodiversity. So we need to plan to get the right fire regime that's going to achieve the goals that we're aiming for. So is your goal to manipulate pasture composition, to reduce woody weeds, or to provide habitat? Each of those may require different types of fires. If you just want to control pasture composition, then cool fires will probably do the job. But to achieve a change from wiregrass dominance to perhaps mitchell grass dominance, you might need to burn for 2 or 3 seasons in a row, or as close to that as you can, to get that flip from good condition, poor condition pastures back to better condition. For woody weeds, we might need to accumulate a lot more fuel to get hotter fires to control those weeds. And fires that move a little more slowly across the ground tend to give better control of weeds, and backburns can achieve that. I noticed talking to graziers in the desert uplands, one of the fellows there reckoned that the best fires that achieved the best woody weed control were the ones that crept around at night time during those wildfires. The ones that went through during the day, that went very quickly, the trees regrew pretty easily after that. But fires that crept around during the night time actually had much better kill rates than the quicker, hotter fires. So we need to ensure that we manage so that we can achieve the fire that we need to achieve our goals. And you might want to exclude fire from some of those sensitive areas, some of our scrub areas that aren't fire climax areas, or even brigalow. So when putting together a strategy for using fire, rate all your paddocks according to their priority. So you'll have paddocks that are a top priority for burning this year, and they might be the ones with the most woody weeds. They could have poor pasture composition. Manage those so that you can get a burn in this year. And then as you get a little bit of rainfall, progressively burn each paddock until you've achieved a burn in all those paddocks you wanted to for the year. Best not to burn all your paddocks because you could end up with fuel, fodder shortages, running out of feed for your stock. Burn one paddock at a time. Obviously, do things like getting a permit from your local fire warden, and that permit is for fire hazard reduction. Be careful of not getting a permit for fire hazard reduction and in some of the green areas and the red areas on your veg map. Minimum fuel loads should be about 1,000 kilograms per hectare of dry matter. Try to burn paddocks at the end of the dormant season, preferably after some rain. Use follow-up burns where that's appropriate, where you need to continue with getting that change from woody dominance or poor pasture composition. But once you've achieved good land condition, then you may be able to reduce your burning frequency back to every 5 years or perhaps every 7 to 10 years. If financial risks are too high to burn and destock an entire paddock, with only a small number of stock. And as I said before, spelling is really important. Ensure that the grazing strategy is consistent with your fire strategy to build up fuel and to allow the pastures to recover afterwards. Again, good planning helps to make fire your servant and for it not to be your master. That brings me to the end of the presentation, and I'd like to acknowledge firstly that some of these slides have come from the EcoRich Grazing Land Management presentations that I know some of you have been to, but the information is readily available from other sources. Desert Uplands supported me with landholder follow-up after the spring 2011 fires near Jericho, and I was back there earlier this year as well. And Queensland DAF, I'd like to thank them and Leading Sheep for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. So I'll leave it there, and if you've got questions, then I'll be more than happy to try and answer those.
All right, thanks, Col. So yeah, if people have got questions, if they'd like to either raise their hand by clicking on the little hand symbol on the right-hand side of your screen, or by typing into the question box, and we can ask them then. So, Col, there's one from Desiree Jackson. Probably a comment, something for you to comment on. Is it a good time to burn in desert uplands? They've got a huge body of rank feed which they can't possibly graze, so is this a good time for them to start burning, a good time of the year? And because the moisture levels are quite high as well, so can they get an effective burn?
Yes, I did mean to mention that earlier, that we've had a pretty good summer and quite good winter rainfall in many parts of central and southern Queensland. And I think now, well, not today because of the wind, but during August, late August and early September is probably a really good time to be burning a lot of that sort of country, particularly the desert uplands. As we know, a lot of people would be a little jumpy in that area because of the fires that occurred last year, but they might be on the front foot a little bit more this year. And I think burning from now on is the way to go. Be a good opportunity, actually, with the moisture in the soil.
Right, very good. There's one from Nicole Slur and her group. what effect does burning have on buffel grass pastures? So you spoke a bit about this, but do you have any more comments on that one?
Yeah, buffel seems to be fairly resilient to burning. It comes back quite readily. As I mentioned, that fellow down at Bollen, Alan Browning on Marillion, he sowed his buffel and then burnt 3 years later, and the buffel comes back by itself. So even though they were quite hot fires there, he managed to get the buffel to come back into those pastures without reseeding. Buffel in our box country can handle fires without too much problem at all. It would come back pretty easily. Buffel also grows obviously in the brigalow country, and I'd be using fire very sparingly in the brigalow country because buffel can tend to build large amounts of fuel, and old buffel pastures tend to have not much. The plants go back to just a few tussocks across the paddock and big spaces in between. So when you burn, it actually exposes that soil to erosion if you get high storm rain. So treat your brigalow country with care if you want to burn that. Sometimes you have to control woody weeds, but that's probably best done at the cooler time of the year when there's sufficient moisture in the ground for the buffel to regrow and give you good ground cover prior to summer storms.
So just going on from that, Col, we've got a question here from Guy Newell, who's at Augustella, saying, hi Col, what about brigalow regrowth management? Are there any golden rules on burning it? So is there anything else you can add to that while you're on the brigalow subject?
Yeah, I was thinking then about some of the sloping country, the flatter areas. I do know there are some people use burning to control their brigalow regrowth, but also the fire also helps to cycle more nutrients. In those old rundown buffel pastures, it can help to recycle some of the nitrogen and reduce the rundown effect, but it is minimal. Fire will help to suppress brigalow regrowth, but it never controls it. But I do know of some people who successfully use fire every 5 to 7 years to actually gain some control of brigalow regrowth. You'd want to do that mainly in your melon hole and flatter country, just to avoid erosion in some of the sloping country.
Righto. Guy, if you've got any more comments on that one, if you'd like to ask Col anything further about brigalow, then if you'd just like to raise your hand and you can ask him in person or over the phone. We've got a question here from, his hand is raised from Phil Bell. So Phil, I'll just unmute you now and if you can ask Col the question. Can you hear us, Phil?
Hey Alex, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, thanks for the session. It's been very enlightening. I've got large areas of country that's still got the black sheen of wet mud. It's got massive veg quantity on it. If I wait till that mud has actually got a dry crust, I could be January, February, March. Can I burn country when it's like that with a big fuel load?
What sort of country is it, Phil?
Well, it's like a box Wilga, Blah, Brigalow country, and then I've got box country that's got a similar, just normal pure red box country that's in a similar state.
And whereabouts are you?
I'm out towards Bollen from St George.
Oh yeah, yep. Yeah, you can burn at that time of year, but obviously the fires are going to be a lot hotter. Now it depends on your situation there. If you want to get control of those like your sandalwood and your box, as I said, Alan Browning burned at that time of year, and he got very good control. Do you have much pasture underneath it?
Yeah, it's just massive amount of pasture and massive amount of previous growth that's just laid down from from all the flooding events we've had.
Yeah, okay. I'd try and burn a little earlier than January, but you may have to test it and see in small areas what it's going to do.
Right, yeah, well that's what I was trying to achieve. I didn't want a hot fire. I was just trying to, but I didn't know whether the mud, you know, having that sheened look about it would suppress things so much that, and I didn't want to do a botch job of it before I found out.
Yeah, well, I'd probably wait till, say, late September, try a small area then, and then see how that works and progressively work into the summer, seeing how it goes each time.
Well, thank you very much.
No worries, Phil.
Righto. We've got another question here from Nicole. If you have cleared a timbered paddock and then want to burn it, how can you stop the scalding you mentioned?
Yeah, I did mention earlier the best way to do that is to try and burn in the cooler part of the year, so that you're actually not going to burn all that timber. Try and burn when it's cooler, with a cooler fire, and also burning after rain is the best way to avoid scalding those areas. Now, it depends on how much timber there is. In the crocodile work that Paul Jones did, there was the area, the mulga that was pulled there, it was just one pull, but there was a pretty high fuel load, and he was quite surprised that there wasn't more scalding than the 10% of the area that he saw. So it depends on the fuel load. If it's really high, then perhaps I'd be trying to burn in the cooler part of the year from now on, and particularly after rain. And if you've got soil moisture in the ground now, it's probably a good time, once this wind settles down, to try and burn later in the day and into the evening.
Right, and I just had another question going on from that one as well, Cole. If you do have scalds, how can we fix them?
Yeah, obviously it's a long, slow process to get grass seed back into those areas. The best answer is to ensure that the stocking rates are reduced so that they're not grazing out the grasses in the remainder of the paddock, and so that they can set seed and start to encroach on those scalded areas. The key is to actually get organic matter back into those areas. Some of the people there may be familiar with some of the work we did with a producer demonstration site down near Bollen. There was property there, I'm just trying to think of the name, Ernie Bladen's, which is northwest, about 30k northwest of Bollen, and that property was had large areas that were completely scalded and from grazing. And what he did was rip every 2 or 3 plough widths and allow weeds. He put forage sorghum back in there. In some cases, just ripping or just tickling that soil surface so that it breaks the surface allows weeds to get back in there, and they can be pioneers. So even things like galvanised burr getting back in there, and some of the copper burrs, allows that transition from no organic matter back to some organic matter, and then that allows a progression through to grasses, your better 3P grasses getting back into the system. So it's a matter of breaking that soil surface, or slowly over time, allowing them to come back naturally.
Righto, we've got a question here. Guy Newell's got his hand raised, so I'll just unmute him and he can follow on from his earlier question. Guy, go ahead.
Yeah, g'day Cole, can you hear me?
G'day Guy, yeah,
can you hear me, Cole?
going? Yes mate, I can hear
good.
you well.
Thanks. I just was wondering about, after Phil's question, we've got a lot of pretty big body of dry standing grass on top of that. Would there be any benefit now, if you're thinking about getting breaks in or perhaps burning sections of a paddock? What would happen now to that winter herbage if you burnt the top off it now? Would there be any chance of that coming back, or would it be buggered after that?
I think it'd pretty well consume that winter herbage. Most of those are annuals, so if they're not given a chance to set seed, a fire is going to take them out pretty well. I can't see, unless it's a really cool fire that just skips over the top, that they would survive it too well.
Right.
So I guess we're going to sacrifice some of that winter herbage, but if the greater goal is to change pasture composition or reduce the woody weeds, then that has longer term benefits, and the shorter term cost is that you're getting rid of the potential grazing you might get from the herbage.
Yeah, I noticed that the soil is quite moist still after the couple of inches that we had a month ago now, and that rain did spoil that top feed, and I just wondered if there would be any feed benefit earlier in the growth season from doing a burn now.
I think there would for the grasses. There's no doubt about that, and you will get other things coming through after you burn as well, because it allows the soil to heat up a little more. Even if you get a burn in that leaves litter on the ground, that litter's usually got a black covering to it, and it absorbs the sunlight and allows the ground to heat up a lot earlier in springtime than it normally would. So that allows a lot of the plants to start growing earlier than they might if the country's unburnt at all. And it can respond to that moisture that's existing in the soil now. So you get a good green pick much earlier than you might do without a fire.
Okay, thanks.
No worries.
All right. Thanks, Guy. I'd just like to make a comment too. If anyone who joined late, if you've got more than one person sitting on your telephone, if you could just write their names in the question box, please, so we know who attended today. Cole, I'll unmute John Hardy from the Longreach area. He's got his hand raised for a question. So, John, go ahead.
Hi, Don. Yeah, just want to ask, do you know, or does anyone else know, if we burn these grasses that are low in energy levels now, will we increase the energy levels of the feed?
Well, only through regrowth. So if you burn the grasses now, what comes through is going to be green pick, and that's going to be much higher particularly in nitrogen, and it will be higher in energy. What is going to be the case, though, is that the regrowth is going to be of a much lower quantity than what you have in the paddock at the moment. So there's still low energy per kilogram of dry matter in the pasture you have, but the quantity of the pasture you have would actually give you a good base feed if you can feed out a protein supplement to your stock. The risk you run is if you burn that and you only get a small quantity of grass regrowing after the fire, that there's not enough feed, not enough energy there for the stock to graze after the fire until we get more rain, that is.
Thank you. Yes, I think we might have missed some opportunities earlier in the year to burn. The rains that we didn't know we were going to get would have been, in hindsight, would have been good to burn then.
Yeah, hindsight's a really good thing, isn't it? For sure. So, but I guess what I'd be trying to do is, if you can afford to burn one paddock and put stock into other paddocks, do that, see how that goes, and then if it comes back sufficiently, then you can put your stock back into that paddock once it's regrown to a suitable stage.
Thank you.
No worries, John.
All right, thank you, John. We've got a question here typed in from Duncan Banks in the Dirranbandi area. What effect does fire have on rank Bambatsi?
G'day, Duncan. Yeah, to be honest, I haven't seen much Bambatsi burned in the past. I do know Bambatsi is one of the panics, and green panic reacts really well to a fire. It actually comes back very strongly, and it loves that extra nitrogen that's cycling in the system. So I can't imagine that Bambatsi would be too much different. And again, I'd be giving that a try to see how it goes. But particularly a cool burn, I imagine it would come back pretty strongly. If you can get a burn in August, I think that'd be could be quite effective. So give it a try in a small area and see how it goes. See if it regrows. I think, Duncan, you might have some moisture in your country down there, so that'll give you a pretty good indication of how it might respond.
Right, Col. Another one from Nicole. If you have a paddock with thick regrowth mulga with very little pasture underneath, could we use fire in this situation?
Yeah, well, you can. It's difficult to get a fire where there's no pasture underneath, and it may be a case of either getting a fire in there when it's really hot to try and get rid of that timber, or allowing the pasture to come through in the summer and then getting the fire into it. I'm just not sure why you would have, is it pulled mulga, or is it a situation where it's standing mulga and there's not much pasture underneath?
Col, I'll just unmute Nicole, and they can answer that question.
Hi.
Nicole?
Yep. Hi, Col. It's previously pulled standing mulga that's regrown again.
Okay. So the regrowing mulga is stopping the pasture coming through. Yeah.
Yep.
Pretty difficult to get a fire into that. Again, the only way to do that is with a lot of heat and dry winds. So that's the best opportunity. I hesitate to say this, but a fellow I know who used to burn at odd times said the best time to burn is in the middle of a screaming drought with a hot wind on a very hot day, and that's probably the only opportunity you would have. Of course, the fire escaping is going to be the big issue there.
Righto, very good. Nicole, do you want to ask your other question you had there as well while you're on the line?
Sure. Does fire trigger a nitrogen release in the soil?
Yes, it does. The extent to which it triggers a release of nitrogen depends on the severity of the fire. But pardon me for coughing. But what happens is when we have pasture growth over many years and we get litter accumulating on the ground, that litter of grass on the ground is actually very poor in nitrogen. And what happens is the bacteria to actually break that litter down have to take nitrogen from the soil to break down the litter. So they're actually robbing the pasture of some of the nitrogen it could be using in its growth. So by burning and consuming some of that litter, it actually makes, and killing some plants in the system, it actually makes some of that nitrogen cycle more readily, and you get much higher quality pasture coming through in the next year than if you had not burnt that paddock at all. So I couldn't tell you exactly how much. It depends on the situation, but there could be an extra 5 to 10 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare is released due to burning and cycling in the system.
All right, Cole, the questions keep coming. Phil Bell's got his hand raised again, so I'll just unmute you, Phil. Go ahead, Phil.
Is there a basic paddock way of measuring your dry matter per hectare?
Yeah. Alex might be able to help you out there, but we have photo standards. Now, the A4 sheets are usually a bit heavier cardboard. Are you there?
Yep, thank you.
That have 3 photos on each side of pastures with different yields, different amounts of pasture. So you can actually compare the pasture you've got in your paddock with the photos and get a bit of a handle on how much pasture you've got in your paddock. Now, you can actually download those off the QDAF Future Beef website, but if you contact Alex, he should be able to help you with that and get you some pasture photo standards that will help to estimate how much dry matter there is.
Well, thank you.
Yep, I can help you with that, Phil.
Thank you very much.
All right, doesn't seem to be too many more questions. So if anyone's got any last questions they'd like to ask, either raise your hand or type them into the question box. But I think, Cole, we've almost answered all the questions we've got for today.
Very good.
Just give a little bit. That seems to be it, I think.
We've pretty much used up our allotted time.
That's right. Right, very good. Thank you for today's presentation, Cole. It was very informative.